A circular saw is one of the most common and useful tools you can own, but it's also one of the most dangerous.
Cost me my fingers.
You gotta go to the hospital.
What?
I just cut the tip of my fucking finger off.
Additionally, professionals use circular saws in ways that may surprise you, and learning these techniques can help you take your projects to the next level of quality and precision. By the end of this video, you'll learn everything you need to know to use a circular saw like a pro. Additionally, at the end, we'll go over some additional accessories that are a game changer for your next project. Now, the first thing to cover when using a circular saw is to use safety gear. Circular saws are dangerous tools that can cause short and long-term harm. Even worse, a circular saw can shoot debris into your eyes, and it only has to happen once to cause permanent damage. Additionally, airborne dust and debris from cutting different materials can also cause irritation and damage your lungs. Speaking of using a circular saw like a pro, Woodworkers Guild of America was invaluable to me in learning the intricacies of using my circular saw, as well as making good quality cuts and maintaining my equipment. So I want to thank Woodworkers Guild of America for sponsoring this video. Woodworkers Guild of America is your online resource for woodworking instructions, ideas, and information. This video on notching with a circular saw was perfect for improving my skills with the circular saw and ensuring this video provides quality information. I also found a video on selecting blades, which made me realize there is a lot more that goes into it than I thought. There's also a ton of projects and great builds to help me continue to improve my shop and my home. I'm always looking for my next project, and fortunately, Woodworkers Guild of America is always creating premium videos to keep you coming back and help you stay inspired. I have a ton of projects that I've saved that I want to end up doing once I find the time. Now, the first 1,000 of you to click the link in the video description will get a full year of premium membership to Woodworkers Guild of America for only $1.49, which is valid for new members only. Back to the video. The loudness of tools can also cause hearing damage over time, so always use eye protection, hearing protection, and a respirator, especially when working indoors or in a small space. Additionally, you're going to want to avoid using loose clothing, jewelry, and leaving your hair long near the circular saw. This will make sure that you keep your limbs out of harm's way. Okay, let's get familiar with our circular saw. One of the first things to always keep in mind is to always keep your saw straight. Now, to do this, you're going to want to use a combination of your marker and the blade. Now, the blade marker at the front of the saw will let you know where the saw is going to cut. Then there's the blade guard. This protects you from the saw. This also protects the saw blade from damage when being stored or set down. Now, in most cases, the guard will retract on its own once you start cutting, but it does have a tab for manually opening the guard for other techniques, which we'll explore later in the video. Now, most saws also have a safety switch. So to start your saw, you're going to want to push the safety switch, and then you can pull the trigger and the saw will start. Then you have your shoe, which is the metal plate at the bottom of your saw, which keeps the saw level while you're making a cut. Now, the shoe has a couple of adjustments, including pitch and depth. You can adjust the shoe up and down, which will let you adjust how thick of a material you want to cut. Okay, now that we're familiar with our saw, we can start making cuts. Now, first, you want to mark your cut on your workpiece. Next, especially when you're starting out and getting familiar with your circular saw, you want to securely support the material you'll be cutting. You want to either clamp it down or somehow attach it to something. Next, rest the saw on the workpiece without the blade touching the work material. Then use the marker at the front of the shoe to align the blade and start your cut. Now, here is where we could take precision to the next level. We want to consider the thickness of our line. Now, the thickness may seem trivial, but it matters. Are we cutting to the middle of our mark? Are we cutting to the outside of our mark or the inside of our mark? This tiny little detail makes the difference. So keep that in mind. In our case, we're cutting to the inner line of our mark. The inner line is best so that when we're complete with our cut, we won't have any markings on our material and it'll be cleaner. Once we have our measurement dialed in, we're ready to align our blade and finally make our cut. Again, let's consider the thickness of our blade as well. When making our cut, we want the very inner edge of our blade to be where our mark is. That way we get the ultimate precision. And with everything lined up and dialed in, we can engage our saw and make our cut. Now, proper technique is to use both hands and slowly push the saw through the material. Now keep in mind that you don't have to push hard. Pushing hard can strain the motor, and if you're having to push hard, it could be a sign of other issues like a dull blade or need of maintenance. Now, if you find that your saw is veering off from where you want to cut, don't try to force it into the proper direction. Correcting your path as you're cutting can be dangerous. You can make small adjustments, but if you feel that you're really having to twist it, you want to stop and start again. This is because twisting the saw can cause kickback and binding. This is because the rear of the blade can end up hooking onto the material, and if this happens, then the direction of the saw is going to cause it to push out of the material and uncontrollably push the material around. So if you need to readjust that blade direction, then you want to stop, let the blade come to a complete stop, lift the saw out, and start the cut again from the beginning. Now, if you find that your cuts are constantly veering out of alignment, then there's possibility that there's other issues, like the shoe being crooked and misaligned, or the blade having some warping issues. Now, this can often happen, especially with the cheaper or lower quality products. Some saws can be adjusted, while others cannot. Now, another common issue you're going to want to avoid is pinching. Now, if you do end up encountering pinching, this will usually present itself as the saw stopping, or in some cases, it could cause kickback. Now, pinching happens when the weight of your workpiece begins to push in on the blade, as opposed to out. Now, in order to avoid pinching, we simply need to consider how the material will behave once we finish our cut. Now, let's take a look at some setups. This setup, for example, is bad, and this other setup here is good. In the first example, once we complete our cut, the wood is going to be pushing onto itself and thus pinching the blade. In the second example, however, once we start finishing our cut, the wood is going to fall away from the blade, thus eliminating the potential for pinching. So always keep this in mind when making a cut and think whether it's going to pinch the blade or pull away from the blade. There are 5 main types of cuts you can do with a circular saw, which include a cross cut, rip cut, bevel cut, plunge cut, and notching, all of which have their own nuances. So let's start with cross cut. A cross cut is where you cut across the grain of your workpiece, and this is what these hand saws are typically designed for. To make this type of cut, we simply use all the best practices we've talked about until this point and make our cut clean and steady. Now, rip cuts are more complicated, and your standard handsaw isn't really designed for it. This is because it involves cutting with the grain. More importantly, rip cuts are usually very long, which makes it hard to achieve with a handsaw. Regardless, we can make rip cuts, and if all you have is a handsaw, we can get excellent results with a couple of tips and tricks. Now, these types of cuts usually require accurate measurements over very long distances, which is what makes it difficult. But we can make this work. Now, to do this, setup is crucial. The main thing here is to get into a position where the saw won't interfere with anything underneath. And for this, we have a couple of options. The first option is to have your material overhanging, and we'll also need to support it on the other side somehow, that be it with a table or some other type of support. This is because as we're cutting a long piece, the overhanging weight is typically too much for the material and it'll end up breaking. So we'll need to support it before making the cut, that way it doesn't flex down and break the board before you're done. Now, setting this up is quite annoying and there are better options. One of the easiest options is to use a couple of pieces of scrap 2x4 that you might have laying around and set the board on top of those. This allows the material something to rest on once it starts hanging. But there's another method that most people prefer. And if you're going to be cutting a lot of material with your handsaw like this, then you might want to consider getting a piece of foam. A sheet of foam is easy to move around and it won't hurt the saw if you cut into it. If you have a piece of foam, you can simply set your plywood over the foam sheet and you can cut away with no concern whatsoever. So if you're commonly making rip cuts like this is the way to go. Okay, we're able to make our cut, but it's not great. It's not bad, but we want it to be perfect. If we look closely, there's squirreliness and it's just not perfectly even, but we can do better. To do better, we need to make a makeshift guide using something very long. Oftentimes you can use a 2x4, but 2x4s are rarely straight, so we want to use something straighter than that. Something like a straight edge, a large beam level, or even a dedicated saw guide. So what you'll need to do is measure from the blade to the end of the saw shoe and make that mark on your material. Once you have your offset mark, we'll want to set our guide on this offset mark. Next, we'll need to clamp it down somehow, and with that, we could run our saw against this guide. And just like that, running it along this guide, we could achieve factory quality cuts with a simple handsaw. Now, miters and bevels are angled cuts on materials. Miters entail an angle on the wide face of the material, while a bevel is an angle on the thin side of the material. Miters are useful for cutting trim, framing, and decking. Wherever two faces meet at an angle, like roof rafters, are a common place for this. In fact, we have another video that explains this in depth if you want to check it out. Now, miter cuts don't require any adjustment on the saw, but it does require some math to get the measurements right. Bevel cuts, on the other hand, do require some adjustment on the saw. Your saw has an adjustment to let the shoe tilt. This tilts the saw, allowing you to make a beveled cut. Now, beveled cuts are commonly used for trim, ensuring that the cut line is moved to the apex of the joint, thus minimizing the visibility of this cut, giving it the appearance of a single piece. Now, bevel cuts, especially long bevel cuts, can prove difficult. And here is where you have to exercise extreme precaution. When a saw is at an angle, it has reduced movement, which means that it's less forgiving for errors or inconsistencies. This next cut can be dangerous: plunge cutting. Plunge cutting involves cutting the wood from the interior face rather than starting from an edge. Now, it involves lifting the guard by hand, which leaves the blade exposed, allowing your body parts to come into contact with that blade. So be careful. Now, this is a technique that you may want to use if you're making an intricate shape in wood and you don't want to butcher the material. Now, you could just make straight cuts all throughout and you could get pretty much whatever you want. But if you want to save that wood and as little pieces as possible for future projects, you're going to want to learn to do a plunge cut. Now, to make a plunge cut, you'll want to pull the saw guard back fully and rest the front of the saw shoe on the line you intend to cut. Then start the saw and slowly lower it into the workpiece. Now, once the saw is all the way down, you can release the guard and begin pushing the saw forward as you would with any typical cut. Now, an important note here is to not cut in reverse during this process. If you try to pull the saw back on the material, you could increase the potential for binding or kickback. So if you notice that you didn't quite start that cut as far back as you needed to, do not pull the saw back. Instead, continue to cut forward as normal. And once you're at the end of your cut, release the power trigger and let the blade come to a complete stop. Once it's stopped, pull the blade out of the material and turn it around and finish that cut in the other direction. Now, if it's a small piece, you could also do it by hand, which could be a little bit easier. Next is notching. Now, notching can be really helpful if you need to make grooves when joining two pieces together and you don't want to rely on the strength of nails and screws. In fact, my main workbench here in the shop was built with notches. These notches add strength and make it look a lot cleaner and flush. Now, this can be tedious, but it's worth the result. Now, to achieve notching, you'll first want to set the proper depth on your blade. In this case, we're using a 2x4, which measures approximately 1.5 inches, though this can vary a little bit, so we'll want to measure it and set our saw to that. Then, on our material, we'll mark the width we want to cut, which is the width of the material. Again, in this case, a 2x4, which is usually 3.5 inches, but we want to make sure and measure that. And with the proper depth and the width marked, the next step is to just cut away again and again between these marks. Once you've cut multiple times in between these two marks and you have these fingers, you'll simply use a chisel to break them all away. Once you've broken them all away, you'll use the chisel again and flatten that surface. And with that, we have an excellent notch that looks good and heavily improves the strength by tying the materials together. Now, let's say you don't own a circular saw and you want to choose one. There's a bunch of sizes and other factors that go into selecting a good saw, but the main one is the blade size. Saws come in many sizes from 5 3/8 inch, 6.5 inches, 7.25 inch, 10 inch, and 12 inch. Now, of course, the larger the blade, the deeper cut you can make. But in my case, I've always had a 5 3/8 inch circular saw, which is the smallest size, but for me, it's been more than enough. Personally, I do plenty of home DIY projects and shop projects, and the tiny 5 3/8 Milwaukee saw has never let me down. Even when cutting larger 4-inch beams, I just cut all the way around and it works just fine. In fact, my only cutting tool when making my workbench here in the garage was this exact 12-volt circular saw. So there you have it. That is everything you need to know about how to use a circular saw like a pro.